to raise hands. We have social norms for all kinds of things, how to order at a fast food restaurant versus a fancy restaurant. We have social norms about how to behave at a football game. We have social norms as well about what is the done thing behind closed doors. In terms of this particular model, we know that there is a normalization of pornography use that has occurred, and that there's a consequent overestimation of how frequent certain sexual behaviors occur. So when you've seen a lot of porn, and then you're asked to evaluate how common is anal sex, you're much more likely to overestimate the frequency with which certain behaviors occur than to underestimate or be accurate. We also know that people who view more pornography engage in more anal and group sex, they report more hookups, and they think this is more normal behavior. Now, there is a downside to these particular cognitive models, and that is that they place the emphasis for both the problem and thus its solution squarely on the individual consumer. So although we may try to change social norms by, say, placing posters up on campus, providing corrective sexual education, it still involves each individual person changing the way they believe and think about pornography. There is another problem with having that particular model, and that is that we require people to behave as rational human beings. I'm not a philosopher, but I do believe that there are different states in which people behave. And there's a wonderful behavioral economist at MIT, Dan Ariely, who did some work on what he called the heat of the moment. What happens in terms of people's willingness to say they will engage in certain behaviors, sexual behaviors, or aggressive behaviors, even what they find sexually arousing, when they are in a cold state, as if just given a questionnaire and asked to fill it out, versus when they are in a hot state, in this case aroused while masturbating to pornography. So he did do this research. I think you can only do it in Cambridge. I can't imagine I'll get away with it in Arkansas, where he gave people questionnaires, and the second time around in the hot state, he actually took a laptop and cellophane wrapped it. Yes, for these men. And they had to press the abort button if they had actually orgasmed. So then they were no longer in the hot state. What he found in this study was that while masturbating and while in a hot state, men were more likely to report a number of behaviors as being acceptable, including having sex with much, much older women, women who were definitely past menopause, much, much younger women, such as the teen and tween years, much more willingness to engage in a variety of sexual behaviors, including anal sex, group sex, bestiality, and much more likely to use coercive measures to obtain sex, such as slipping someone a drug and a drink, or lying to someone in order to get them to agree to have sex with you. Now, if we know that people in a cold or rational state will say one thing, such as, yes, I really will stop doing this. I know it's hurting. I know it's against my values. I know that this is not the person I want to be and the way I want to behave. But then we require them to remember that in a hot state, when the frontal lobes have been essentially shut off by a flood of arousal, we have a problem. We're not going to be able to do that successfully. This is state-dependent learning. It has implications, I think, for sex education and for how we address this problem. In contrast, I want to offer up the cultural climate model as being the way to understand both pornography's effects and this shift towards a pornified culture. Now, I think we've been dancing around this all day. There have been great questions asked about whether hardcore is a separate phenomenon versus the fabric of something. We had a question earlier asked about what, are all these things related somehow? What is the effect that gender in general, or the way we bring people up in general, playing in this phenomenon? I think the cultural climate theory is the answer. What it says is that pornography is one of something that contributes to an environment in which violence against women and violence against one another becomes acceptable. So pornography is a manifestation of a cultural problem, not its root cause. That means that we can't just intervene at the level of the pornography. One of the things I loved about Pamela Paul's book was that I think she understood this very well. You can get rid of a video, but you're still selling a Bratz doll. You can get rid of a particular website, but you are still telling people that they ought to dress a certain way when they come to campus, and that they ought to drink in order to hook up, in order to have friends in college. And therefore, I don't think that we can separate out what is a particular X-rated phenomenon from an entire pornified culture. Importantly, and as we begin to think about how to make this more public and known, is that we have to acknowledge that people see others as being influenced by this culture, but not ourselves. This is called the third-person effect. We're much more likely to see others as vulnerable to things like advertising messages, but we believe we have a lot of autonomy and control over our own behavior. So we think we are not influenced by these things, and we're wrong. I think that the implications of taking sexual script and a cultural climate theory is that we really have to have what is a little bit more like a radical feminist socio-political position to address this. What I mean by that is this. This culture, the way it stands, the way gender relationships stand, is not a culture that we can have a healthy sexuality. It's not a culture that permits both men and women to become fruitful, engaged, intimate, deeply connected human beings and have those kinds of relationships. It is a culture that relies on the commodification of bodies, that where a person's worth is determined primarily by their physical appearance, and it is a culture in which it makes it very difficult for us to move forward. I loved the talk we had earlier today about neuroplasticity, and it talked about not just the brain being the product or the cause of culture, but also a product. So I think we are training our brains, and I think that the reverse is happening. I think we can address this, but we have to address it with new models of healthy sexuality and gender relationships, models that are not based on power differentials, where one is valued more than another, models in which sexual behavior has ample opportunity to be expressed, but expressed in a way that is morally consistent with our values, and in which people are not reduced to what they can do for another as an object, but that are truly valued for their core being. So with that, I will stop and open the floor.